Hello, this is Kevin Armentrout of Kevin Armentrout Photography, and in this video we're going to be going over exposure basics. Welcome back everybody, and welcome to a multi-part series of photography basics that I'm calling In a Flash. In a Flash is going to discuss the basics of photography from exposure to camera settings to composition and get you the fundamental knowledge that you need in order to start photography and start your photographing journey. So, this video is the first video in the multi-part series called Exposure. Now, what is exposure? No, I'm not talking about your followers on Instagram and how to get more people to view your content. I'm talking about exposure as in the measurement of light that comes into a camera. Well, while that may seem overly trivial, it is one of the fundamental principles of photography. Photography is all about light. So how do we quantify exposure? Exposure is measured in stops. Well, what is a stop? Well, one stop is the measurement of doubling the amount of light that is visible in a scene. So if you increase the amount of light by 2 times, that means you have increased the exposure by 1 stop. And conversely can be said for if you decrease the amount of light by half. Now, it's important to know what a stop is before we proceed, because stops are how we relate the 3 parts of the exposure triangle together. So you may have seen this graphic before. This is the exposure triangle. In my opinion, this graphic doesn't do a particularly good job of explaining what exposure is. Sure, you can see that on ISO, as you increase the ISO, you increase the exposure, you add more light. As you reduce the shutter speed, you increase the exposure, you add more light. And as you open up the iris of your camera, you reduce the f-stop and you add in more light. Now, this isn't particularly helpful to beginning photographers because you have this triangle. What do these mean? How do we use this triangle? Is this some sort of Pythagorean theorem problem over here? No. This triangle just merely shows the relationship between the 3 components, that they are supposed to be in symmetry and balance. So the first part of the exposure triangle we are going to discuss is ISO. Now, is it ISO? It's all uppercase. How do you pronounce this? If you say ISO or ISO, people are going to know what you're talking about. Now, what is it? Well, back when film was the method of shooting photos, ISO was the actual sensitivity of the film to light. Now when cameras switched from film to digital, the method of measurement of light changed. Instead of exposing a piece of film, what you're doing now is actually projecting light onto an image sensor on your camera. That image sensor passes through an analog to digital converter, and that represents the amount of light that's on that part of the sensor. Now, you may be thinking that amount of light is fixed and constant, and you'd be right. So what does ISO do? It no longer represents what we're talking about here, has the sensitivity of film. Well, ISO now functions as digital gain. Most camera sensors use a base ISO of 100, which represents what the camera sensor actually saw for the period of time that it was exposed. When you double the ISO from 100 to 200, what you're doing is doubling the gain. Basically, each one of the channels from red, green, blue, and white are going to double in value. Same can be said again when you double it from 200 to 400. That gain increases by twice the amount. And from 400 to 800, the principle remains the same. Now what you may be saying to yourself is, what's the detriment to this? If we could just double the amount of light that we saw on a camera sensor, then we can basically shoot in any level of light situation. Well, not so fast. There is a trade-off to everything in photography, and the trade-off to increasing the ISO is actually increasing noise. Now, while you may be thinking that you're getting a perfectly clean image whenever you click the shutter on your camera, it's not the case. There's actually a small amount of noise that gets passed through, and as you increase the ISO, the signal-to-noise ratio drops. And after you have a specific amount of signal-to-noise ratio go over a certain threshold, your image becomes grainy. So while you can technically increase the ISO and get a usable picture, there is a trade-off to everything. Okay, let's talk about shutter speed now. Shutter speed is the amount of time that the camera sensor is exposed whenever you click the shutter. And because the sensor is only exposed for a small amount of time, it has to capture all of the information of the scene in that small period of time. So, as you increase the shutter speed, you are reducing the amount of light that is on your sensor. Well, how does this relate to exposure? Well, when your shutter triggers, that duration of time allows light for however long that interval is for your shutter speed. Now, this light interval may seem very short. Oftentimes, if you're going to be shooting portraits, you're going to be shooting at around a 125th of a second, and that camera sensor is only exposed for that really, really short period of time, so it has to gather all the light information of the scene in that short period of time. So if you were to reduce your shutter speed down to 1/250th of a second from 125th of a second, that reduces the amount of light on your sensor by that same proportion, which would be a half. Like ISO, shutter speed has a trade-off, and that trade-off is motion blur. Think about it for a second. If your camera sensor is exposed and your subject is moving, the light that the sensor sees is going to be both the point that you originally intended on shooting and any of the changes to the subject in that period of time. Alright, with that in mind, we're going to move on to the next component of exposure, which is the aperture. Now, what is an aperture? Well, as you can see here with this graphic, an aperture is the iris at the end of your camera lens. As the aperture opens, it lets more light in, and as the aperture closes, it lets less light in. This seems very, very easy in principle, and it is. The way aperture is presented is in f-stops. The terms f-stop and aperture are used pretty interchangeably in photography. If you were to lower your aperture from f4 to f2.8, you would be increasing the amount of light into your camera sensor by twice as much. Now, if you remember earlier about what the definition of a stop is, that would be increasing the amount of light by 1 stop. So if you were to have a perfectly exposed subject and then you were to increase the amount of light by 1 stop, you would have to compensate by one of the other parameters, whether it be ISO or whether it be shutter speed. Alright, let's talk about some physical limitations of cameras. Your camera has an ISO range which it can shoot at, from its base ISO all the way up to its maximum ISO. This range is defined per camera. The same can be said for shutter speed and aperture. While shutter speed is defined by the actual physical limitations of the camera shutter, the aperture is defined by the physical limitations of the camera lens. Your camera lens can only close and open so much. These physical limitations are your constraints for exposing a photograph. Well, this may sound like a lot of information, and it really is, but the basic point here is that you are controlling the amount of light that hits your camera sensor. Now, how you do that is by those 3 components: ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Thank you all for joining me today. The next video in the series is going to be about shutter speed and the trade-offs between using higher and lower shutter speeds. If you like this video, be sure to like below and subscribe for future content. Once again, my name was Kevin Armentrout, and this is Kevin Armentrout Photography. Is this thing in focus? Yes.